Hi, I'm Obsessing Again. In 2008, Mirror's Edge released a new, colourful parkour experience. 8 years later, a reboot, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, launched. For all the hype, anticipation and promise, the game just fell flat. The difference between the first Mirror's Edge and Catalyst is vast. On paper, the second outing improved on most factors to the original. Strict linear levels in a parkour game contradict what it's all about. Freedom, versatility and utility are all things we associate with parkour. You could combine moves of running along a wall and jumping, finding smoother and quicker ways to get to your objective, but no alternative to deviate. And yet we accepted it for what it was, because of how intriguing and unique everything around it was. It's a game that is fondly admired all these years later. Mirror's Edge was a slow burner, gently stewing an appetite for another instalment. The linear free-running game was a groundbreaking experience. Vibrantly coloured buildings, balanced by the stark whitewash, it feels like an evolution from the Y2K movement, like futuristic minimalism. When you control Faith, you're not told too much about the world, you just exist among it. She merely states,
"Once the city used to pulse with energy, dirty and dangerous, but alive and wonderful. Now, it's something else. The changes came slowly at first. Most didn't realize, or didn't care, and accepted them. They chose a comfortable life. Some didn't. And those who refused to conform were pushed to the sidelines, criminalized. They became our clients."
It's a succinct way to bring you up to speed with the design of the world and Faith's motivations. I also feel it acts like the opening Star Wars crawl, saying enough to get the story running. It was so groundbreaking for the mechanics and the design of the world. In the mid-2000s there were lots of gritty open world settings. Few were in first person, so this has stood the test of time aesthetically. The gameplay wasn't perfect, but it was admired for having a strong vision, differentiating itself from the other AAA games. Because of the linear levels, the emphasis on speed and evading enemies, you don't get a chance to ponder your surroundings, not when you're ziplining across buildings and having shootouts. When it was announced that Catalyst was an open world, it should have been the perfect sandbox, combining the fun game mechanics from the previous game and the endless possibilities of how to gain speed and keep momentum. And yet, it's by far one of the dullest open world experiences. Regardless of the few NPCs, there are very few moments of discovery or intrigue. Adding an open world doesn't improve upon the original Mirror's Edge. Open worlds are sandboxes for creativity, to push the world to its limits, creating your carnage. It had elements when the servers were live for users to generate their time trials, but besides that, it's just a means to go to a checkpoint. Most sci-fi open worlds like Cyberpunk 2077 will depict the dark underbelly of dystopian worlds. And while not every sci-fi world needs this, what does Catalyst have that's compelling beyond its visual aesthetic? In today's world, Amazon Prime deliveries have made people more impatient, ordering things and within a date on your doorstep. Catalyst expands upon this with time trial deliveries for runners, but it's meaningless and raises more questions about the purpose of being a runner and not to the game's benefit. You might deliver delicate items or wasters, but it seems so unnecessary to do these trivial deliveries in a matter of minutes. Is it a societal take on the culture of people's needs? Hardly. They feel more like ways of padding out meaningless chores. Runners allow for messages and deliveries to be done off record, but the desperation in the delivery seems so trivial and begins to stick out the more you do. To expand upon this, if runners are anti-establishment, wanting to be off the beaten track, then what function do they have in society? Are they merely passing notes and deliveries on the sly? Some runners will still, but I find it hard to believe most of these pleasant, well-adjusted people are this devious. In games that require traversal, we've come to accept the realities of having painted wall edges or intricate rocky cliff textures, implying you can climb up. Mirror's Edge doubled down. Instead of shying from it, they created these visual cues as part of its design. It was genius, and this continues in Catalyst. Your sense of direction has been incorporated with the runner's vision. It's optional but takes away from the game completely. It's a setting you can toggle, but the open world without it doesn't feel intuitive enough to be left to your own devices. This red-stranded mist makes you mindless. You don't think about your moves, you do it numbingly. You're aimless, which you can be in parkour, but without thought, it's dangerous. The charm of the original Mirror's Edge was through its sense of speed, not wanting to slow down or stall. It hinted where you needed to go, but didn't hold your hand to each objective. There are some moments of transitioning to another part of the map where it's essential to follow a specific path, which defeats the point of what EA is trying to do here. The open world of Catalyst expands upon Mirror's Edge with humongous digital advertising boards and lots of neon lights. At a glance, sprinting by, they are moments of beauty, but if you halt and just examine the world, it's just drab. The cars that try to give the impression of depth look laughably simplistic, and the character models are so bare that it feels more like a fever dream. The buildings have a space age feel, glass and beautifully light geometric curves are worlds apart from today's world. But like I said about the cars, too long spent looking off into the distance makes the traversal world feel smaller. In older open world games, the outer area is lifeless, as is Mirror's Edge. If you left Cyberpunk idle, the world continues and people are moving. And Mirror's Edge Catalyst feels stuck in time, like a snow globe on a high shelf. Without the feeling of danger by leaping across buildings, all of a sudden the height you're at feels irrelevant, and the high rise feels more like a grounded parkour in desolate parks. Mirror's Edge Catalyst wants to badly convey depth, be it an open world, an interweaving story or quirky characters. The open world is designed to be a sandbox for exploration for the user, and there's very little. Security boxes, cameras and mundane deliveries can be ways of creating depth, but this is merely padding out game time. What was a punk game having an edge has become overly poppy, watered down and far from what made it unique. Now to the protagonist, Faith Connors. She's a pilot for the story. The more cinematic cutscenes gives you more to chew on in this story compared to Mirror's Edge cartoony strips. But the story element is quite bland, wanting you to care about newly established characters who are briefly introduced with little knowledge of who they are. She's underwhelming for how underutilised she is and what she could be. Her visual appearance is undeniably cool. With Catalyst, the opportunity to combine phenomenal visuals and a compelling protagonist or varied story that doesn't lay its tropes bare could have elevated this game into cult classic status. Catalyst provides an array of quirky characters with memorable names but is muddied with characters like Plastic who are stereotypically boring and nothing an audience can vouch for. The antagonist of the story is maniacal but dull and boring in Gabriel Kruger. His onslaught of faceless Kruger-sec guards are dumbed down AI with batons, rifles and limp arms that don't offer much of a challenge, even when they are repopulated multiple times as you flee frenzies. Like most games, there are varying levels of what you can do, adding slight variety which comes into play later in the story, but once you've fought most of them head on a couple of times, there's little left you can do or experiment with. Most of my videos will typically focus on characters, themes and arcs, but this story is half-baked. The biggest undeniable improvement is combat and traversal. For all of its successes, Mirror's Edge is seen with rose-tinted glasses. At times, you'd fight the game when trying to jump along pipes, or making jumps that looked easy and you'd plummet to your death. Catalyst is more robust, and wall running and jumping onto ledges is done with more ease. A simple skill tree can expand upon these, breeding slightly more life. Catalyst introduces new tools to make traversal fun, but it's painful. They don't progress your freedom to explore the open world, they're strict linear ways to access parts of the map that are inaccessible without it. This feels like a missed opportunity for exploration and stumbling upon interesting asset design to further engross us in the world. They're more like playable cutscenes to access different parts of the world. Earlier I mentioned combat. I admired the use of guns in Mirror's Edge. You're not a soldier or a shooter, so to wave a gun shooting about a little carelessly was fitting. But whether it was fitting doesn't necessarily make for compelling gameplay or fun. The big reason I felt it didn't work was because it slowed the gameplay down. The adrenaline rush became an adrenaline dump. The combat or kicking and slide tackling into enemies is fun, though repetitive. You feel like you can have more control over Faith, and the level design lends itself better to Faith's fighting capabilities. It's unlikely Mirror's Edge will return, but I'd love to see more gadgets that can be used to disarm guards that were in keeping with Faith's character. Parkour is about intuition, about your world's surroundings. Famous tracer David Bell said, Parkour is really a practice of getting to know yourself, what you're able to do and what are your limits. As you train, you start knowing what you can do. Now, with Mirror's Edge, you can traverse up pipes or slide down the sides of buildings with very little thought, but what the open world design fails to do mechanically is provide varied movement vertically. Take The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2. Gameplay wise, shooting in both games are similar, with an emphasis on weapon sway and making each bullet count. For movement, Part 2 allows characters to run, dive or climb upon objects. It makes enemy encounters more dynamic, less stale. Insomniac's Spider-Man was praised for making web swinging purposeful by seeing webs attached to buildings. People believed it could surpass the iconic Spider-Man 2 by Treyarch. So in Spider-Man 2, websuits were introduced and became revolutionary, as opposed to evolutionary. My critique on Catalyst's vertical traversal is there's very little. In a world of sci-fi, runners with digital contact lenses and gadgets, traversal is quite limited. The grapple could have been used to propel you into the air as you glide back down, running on the walls, getting aerial advantage from the drones. For all my critiques, is this a terrible game? No, it has moments of being enjoyable. You can mindlessly run around, jumping and pulling yourself around a vibrant map. The undeniable downside is expectation. What was and still is a revolutionary game in Mirror's Edge, the years that went by with no news only made fans yearn to parkour and high-rise buildings. Catalyst, by its definition, an acceleration, a rate of increase, should have been its own catalyst to drive more interest in this universe, but it failed to meet its landing. Thank you for letting me obsess again.